Hi, it's Aruna, Claire, and Parampreet, and we're your trainers in the online training of the Ambassador Yoga 200-hour training. Today, we're going to talk about some of the myths of yoga that people learn through yoga classes or social media or even the media that you might get a mistaken idea about what yoga is all about. And that's what we're going to look at today.
These are the things that we can get clarified in a 200-hour yoga teacher training program. These are the things we look at when we deepen our understanding and study of yoga.
Today we have 7 myths that we're going to look at. And we're going to start with the kind of myth. We're going to start with the first one and then move on to more and more subtle myths. So that's going to be fun. So possible myth number 1, yoga is about physical postures, or also known as asanas. Now, most yoga teachers, and especially teacher trainers, know this is not true, but often in the general conception of, people may think, if they're just watching, as Aruna said, a TV commercial or what they've heard about it, they might think that yoga is about physical postures. And that is not true. In fact, the exact opposite is true. Even in the very central text, Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, Patanjali only talks about asana or posture in 3 out of 196 sutras. And they're all in the second chapter. And the first one is verse 46, Sutra 46, Sthira Sukham Asanam, which basically is saying, sit down in a very easy and steady pose. And the following verses talk about how the point of that is so you can have a good meditation. And that's pretty much it for Patanjali's direction on asana, because at the time of Patanjali, yoga was mostly about meditation, mostly about understanding what your body mind was in relation to something bigger than you. Then it was about the connection of your specific consciousness, we can say, to a bigger consciousness. Even if we look at the texts other than Patanjali, like the Mahabharata, which is the source text for the Gita Bhagavad Gita is just a small part of the Mahabharata. It mentions yoga hundreds and hundreds of times, but it only mentions asana a couple of times. And again, it's in preparation for meditation. Now, there is one old text that mentions more asanas, and that's the Hatha Yoga Pradipika. That one mentions postures, but they're just really basic postures, nothing like the multiple postures that we have in modern yoga. And that's what we really want to get across. Modern yoga is full of hundreds of postures. They're very helpful, but that is a modern version of yoga. The original version of yoga was mostly not about postures.
I think that is a very common myth that yoga is about physical postures. And I myself have believed that as well. I remember thinking that there was some virtue that came with being able to touch my head to my legs in a sitting forward fold. Like I remember the moment I first was able to do that, thinking that was some kind of virtuous act on my part. And I see that all the time on Instagram, like people like, oh, I can finally do the splits. I can finally put my toe to my head or something. That I feel like that connection to the body, it feels like some part of the path of yoga. But in my journey of yoga, I think I realized at some point that the asana was just one little piece of whole lifestyle that goes along with yoga, and that now that I'm over 50, my practice has changed a lot from when I first started doing yoga, and that the virtue does not come from whether your body can go into a certain shape and whether your toe can reach a certain body part. And now we're seeing in yoga that actually that creates a lot of injuries for teachers and students when they fall for that myth that yoga is about postures.
As a yoga teacher and trainer, of course, we see these myths a lot. I find that in social situations, once people find out I'm a yoga teacher, one of the most common responses is, I love yoga, I go every day, or I'm not flexible enough to do yoga, or yoga is too slow for me. And I really think it is a disservice to not properly understand that yoga is not all about the postures, because it can be a gateway for people to begin a yoga practice, but it can also be a deterrent for people to start a practice which has a lot of benefit, because they feel like they can't do certain things with their body. So we are really excited to be here dismantling these myths to make yoga more accessible to everybody and get to the truth of what yoga is and what it is not.
Yeah, no, I like that because that idea that yoga is about physical postures can actually deter someone from starting the practice.
Possible myth number 2. Patanjali is the founder of yoga. Or we might think that the teaching of yoga begins with Patanjali in the Yoga Sutras. Well, yes, Patanjali is a central figure in yoga philosophy, but yoga philosophy itself predates Patanjali by hundreds of years. He's not the founder of yoga because it was a meditative practice even more ancient than him. It goes back to the Vedas, it goes back to the Upanishads, and even the Buddhist sutras talk about yoga as a meditative practice. We talked about the Mahabharata earlier. In the Mahabharata, we learned that it is actually Hiranyagarbha who is the founder of yoga. This is a story about how the world was created and how one of the first beings that was created out of Vishnu's navel was the teacher of yoga. So there's that story. So we know yoga existed before Patanjali. Krishna in the Gita, in the Bhagavad Gita, he talks about various types of yoga. He talks about karma yoga, he talks about jnana yoga, raja yoga, bhakti yoga. And in fact, each of the 18 chapters in the Gita has the word yoga after it. So this is all to say yoga existed long before Patanjali, but Patanjali did bring together a lot of the ideas that existed around his time and formulate them into his yoga philosophy system. That's why the very first sutra talks about atta. So atta is the very first word saying, now we're going to talk about yoga. And he assumes you already know a lot about it, but now he's going to talk about yoga. It already existed as a teaching and as a practice. Okay, possible myth number 3. Yoga has 8 limbs, and it's also known as Ashtanga, 8-limbed. Now, we just talked about Patanjali not being the founder of yoga, but one thing he did do, he created a yoga system that had 8 sections or 8 steps. And that's what the word asht means. It means 8, and anga means limb. So it's actually asht anga are the 2 words. I know we say ashtanga or ashtanga and think that it's ash and tanga, but no, it's actually asht anga. And both before Patanjali's time and after Patanjali's times, there were other limbed systems, other step systems. Some of them had 6 steps, some of them had 10 steps, some of them had 15 steps. So yes, He created the 8-limb system, but that doesn't mean yoga itself has 8 limbs. Some yoga systems leave out the niyamas and yamas and add other things in. So that's something also that can be investigated. There are more types of yoga than 8-limbed yoga systems.
So when we study the 8 limbs that Patanjali taught about, we are studying one system that is a valuable study. And we want to understand that this is in the context of many different systems that existed in yoga.
One of the things that we see happen in our yoga teacher training programs, the journey that the students take, they do follow this 8-limb path, which we understand is not the only path to understanding yoga, but it is methodical and it is systematic, and it does essentially provide an outline or a guide to help people understand themselves, understand life, cope with life, and make it through this system little by little, study by study, practice by practice. So it's very beneficial in my experience.
Definitely, I would say it is a central system now because of how well Patanjali arranged it. So it's an important system, and it definitely leads to a deeper understanding of self. So it's an important system, and that's why it's used, and that's why it's become popular. So I know, Claire, you've talked about that, how when people come out of the 200-hour training, they really feel like they've experienced a depth of themselves they hadn't experienced at the start of the training.
When we talked earlier about the disservice of not knowing what yoga is, not only is Ashtanga yoga or the 8-limb path a system of yoga, but I know in the West, some people do confuse it with a style of yoga, a very rapid moving style of yoga with a certain set of postures and sequences. And that's where I think people get confused, and where these myths come from is really understanding the truth of these words that we hear. Is Ashtanga a type of yoga, or is it a methodology?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point,
Okay.
that uh, Ashtanga yoga as a brand is
Yeah.
very different from the words Ashtanga, which just means,
Yeah.
it just means 8 limbs. That's all that means.
Which is
And it's very important what you're saying, that
Yeah, which is why I was told I was taking an Ashtanga yoga teacher training, where I never did the primary series, but I did learn the 8-limb path. So, like, which one is it?
possible myth number 4. Yoga is about union, and the purpose is to unite body, mind, and spirit. The first part of this, that yoga is about union, yes, the word yoga is related to the word to yoke, which means to unite, to come together. But in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras and in yoga philosophy, the purpose is not to unite body, mind, and spirit. It's exactly the opposite. I know, shocking. The point is to separate the body and mind from your true self so you can be immersed in your true self. And that self is known as Purusha, or pure consciousness. In the third sutra, Patanjali talks about tada drashtuhu swarupe avasthanam. Tada, then, drashtuhu, the seer, which is us, swarupe, our true nature, avasthanam, we become that, we become immersed in that, we are that. So yoga is actually not about union. It's about separating whatever you might consider to be you, your mind and body, and immersing yourself in that true self. And your mind and body is just put aside right now in the meditative state. So how do we do that? Well, that's where the 8 steps we talked about earlier come in, through the yamas, through the niyamas, by pushing away distractions of the world, and through dhyana, dharana, samadhi, which are through concentration, through meditation, through contemplation, until we arrive at that absorption stage. So we're trying to tune out the world. We're trying to tune out our senses. We're trying to quiet down our mental activities. And we're doing the opposite of uniting with them.
Which to me is actually interesting because when I guide yoga classes, it's all about the coordination of the breath with the movement and the focus of the mind. So it's almost like you have to, like the sub layer is to have the union. And then once you get past that, you can separate yourself from the mind body. It's complex. This is why we need 200 hours to discuss this.
No, I think that's a good point. I mean, certainly you have to become in contact with and understand and like unite with aspects of yourself to better understand them. So that's definitely layers, as you said, and steps to it. So, you know, when you're doing a pose, you want to be fully in connection to the different parts of your body so you can better understand them. And the reason for that is, okay, this is my body. I get it. This is what's happening with it. It's stable now, as we talked earlier. It's stable in the pose. Now I can move on. So yeah, there is that aspect of the union, but the final end result of Patanjali's yoga philosophy, and we have to keep in mind we're talking about yoga philosophy as instructed by Patanjali, is to put that aside and move on from that.
I think one of the ideas of union is, or yoga as union, is that when I see students thinking about the union of body, mind, and spirit, like I can see them think like, oh, I feel my spirit in my body right here, you know, like often around their heart or something, not usually their head. Um, then I think the idea of union is that not that you're finding your spirit in your body, but finding your body in your spirit. Like the body dwells in the spirit.
Yes, the body is a part of reality, but it would be inaccurate to say that your body is in spirit or that everything is spirit united. There is an aspect of consciousness that underlies everything, but the material world and the mental world are of a different nature in yoga philosophy than Purusha or the consciousness world. So it would not be accurate to say that they're like the same together, one thing at any point or time. But it's actually not accurate to say everything is spirit,
Right.
technically, in Patanjali philosophy. It is to in other philosophies, but not in Patanjali philosophy. Okay, possible myth number 5. The objective of yoga is to become completely sattvic. Now, what this refers to is that the material world and the mental world is full of 3 types of things, or 3 gunas, they're called, qualities. That is sattva, rajas, and tamas. And the idea is in the yogic lifestyle, you want to be purely sattvic, full of sattva, and just eliminate all rajas and tamas. This isn't quite accurate because you can't completely eliminate rajas and tamas. You need them to exist in a body. The body is formed of them. You know, just like we can't completely eliminate stress from the muscles, we need them to sit, we need them to stand, we need them to move, and we need them to do yoga. When we're in any yoga pose, yes, there's aspects of our muscles that are completely relaxed. But if a muscle is completely relaxed, it also means some other muscle is under stress or not necessarily tight, but active. And it's the same thing with rajas and tamas in the body. Tamas refers to something heavy, something dense. Rajas refers to some activity, some fire. So we need activity and fire in our stomach to digest food. We need tamas, we need heaviness. Otherwise, we just like float off into the ether. We need to be slowed down with tamas. Otherwise, we couldn't sleep. So yes, we want to maximize sattva in ourselves, in our body, mind, but we can't completely eliminate rajas and tamas. We have to have some of them in order to exist. So in a short form, we need to maximize sattva and have the ideal amount of rajas and tamas.
I think that speaks to the point where sometimes the perception is if you are a yogi, you are calm and peaceful and blissful at all times. Not true for me. So, right. So I think that's right. We need to have the other motivating factors, the rajas and the tamasic qualities that help us. One thing that I have found is that in an effort to be more peaceful, there are still elements of having a human life and a human lived experience that are not peaceful. But because of that awareness, when we have those unpeaceful experiences, they motivate us into action, which would be a rajasic quality. And that's not a bad quality. We have to move through the action to get to the peace. Same with a tamasic quality. It's often described as heavy and dark and lethargic, but sometimes we need to stop and rest.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. There's that old aphorism or something. Sometimes you need to use a thorn to take out a thorn. And I think that is very true, that we need the rajas and tamas as a means to appreciating and understanding the sattvic aspect of us, because the fact is, we have a body, and what you said is like, they're not bad. We need them. They help us function in life. It's just that once they start to dominate, it becomes an issue. Like, yes, tamas is an aspect of helping us sleep, but we don't want too much of it, because we don't want to sleep 15, 20 hours a day. We want to sleep an ideal amount, and the rest of the time, we want to be of light, clear mind. So yes, they're not bad. They're just can't predominate.
And of course, yoga teaches us how to keep those gunas in a healthy balance, how to recognize them, how to notice them, be aware of where they're sitting in your body mind. And then it gives us the tools to keep them in check and keep them in a balanced way, which is what I love about yoga. It doesn't just tell you what the problem is, it also gives you the solution.
Possible myth number 6. The aim of yoga is to know the self. Now, earlier we talked about Sutra 3 being Tada Drashtuhu Swarupe Avasthanam. The seer is immersed in their true nature, or in their true self, which is true. But here's the issue. When you are immersed in your true self, there is no mind and body. So you can't know anything. You won't know anything. You are completely Purusha. You are pure consciousness beyond body and mind. The objective is to be in your true nature, not to know your true nature.
That is interesting, mind blowing. There's so many layers to what we think yoga is. And then we have just a statement like that, which takes us so far from the postures, what people think yoga is, into a comment like that, where it's just almost too much to comprehend. So it does take deep study. And it takes an experienced teacher, I think, to guide us through these deep concepts.
These are really subtle differences, like to to know the self, then someone is the knower of the self. Whereas to be yourself, you just are. Like, it's a very subtle difference, but it's an interesting distinction to ponder and meditate on.
And I think that's an important point. Yes, it's a very subtle distinction. And it's important to talk about it because it may seem technical, but if you ponder it, you realize that, there's other layers or other places you can go with these ideas that might deepen your understanding of these ideas. And that's really what the point of explaining all of these ideas in this video is right now, just to make you aware of these subtle differences. Possible myth number 7. The aim of yoga is to attain samadhi. This one is kind of true, actually, to be honest. It's not completely true, but it's kind of true. That's why I'm putting it under the myth category. So Patanjali tells us when our mind becomes sattvic, it becomes more and more pure. The difference between Purusha, our pure consciousness, and Prakriti, our matter and mind body, becomes more and more clear. And as we go through the 8 steps of asana, dharana, dhyana, the next step is samadhi. So when we're in that first stage of samadhi and experiencing it in the body, that's called samprajnata samadhi, which we can think of as samadhi with understanding. You understand you are more than the body. You are more than the mind. So yes, we are attaining samadhi, but that's not the final stage. And that's why this is a myth. You have to go beyond that stage to another level of samadhi, and this asamprajnata samadhi, which is samadhi without understanding. Now, that seems like a weird thing to say, samadhi without understanding. It doesn't mean you don't understand samadhi. It means, as we talked about in the earlier myth, you are beyond your mind. So there's no sense of understanding. There's no sense of knowing. There's no sense of, oh, look at me, I figured it out. So you are beyond those categories. So first, you have the samadhi with understanding, then you have the samadhi without understanding.
I feel like it's like the great unlearning. You have to know what you don't know to know that you don't know, and that is okay. And we've been
Yes.
seeing a lot of unlearning in the last couple of years. So it's like you have to learn enough. It's like the more you learn, the less you know. I think that's the saying. But it's not in a way of not knowing. It's in just not. You're just transported to a whole different level of being.
In an earlier myth, you talked about uniting with the asanas, the poses, Claire. So we can kind of have that as an analogy again, where, when you're first doing a pose, you have to understand all aspects of that pose, the alignment, the pressure points, the grounding, and you have to know all of these things. But at some point, you have to let go of that and just be the pose. You're not supposed to be like thinking these things every single time you're doing the pose. You've just becoming the pose. So it goes back to what you're saying. That's sort of like a good analogy for what's happening in samadhi as well.
That reminds me of that whole drive when you first learn to drive a car. You're thinking about everything. And then once you drive a car for a long time, you don't have to think about it. You just do it.
Yes, and unfortunately, when you're driving a car, then you can start to think about other things and you're still safely driving a car, but now your mind is elsewhere. And you know what you need then? You need Patanjali's 8 steps to get to samadhi, but not while you're driving. Because we've talked a lot about Patanjali, we've talked about Ashtanga Yoga, 8-limbed yoga, I felt like we had to have a bonus myth, a myth number 8. And that myth is, by doing yoga, you can liberate your mind. Unfortunately, this is not true. According to yoga philosophy, our true nature is covered by 2 types of body: a physical body, which is here, our senses, our body of the senses, and a mental body, a subtle body, which is our mind. And the intention in Patanjali Yoga is to separate that body, mind, body, so to speak, and just put it off to the side and immerse yourself in your true nature. So at that point, you are permanently immersed in Purusha. You can be liberated from the body mind, from your physical existence, from your mental existence, and be completely at one with pure consciousness. But at that point, as we've discussed earlier, your mind does not exist. Your mind is not there to be liberated. And I have a good example of this. You know, a while ago, I needed a new computer mouse. So I went out and bought the mouse. It came in one of those ridiculous hard plastic cases where you think you can open it just by with your hands, but you can't. You're going to end up cutting yourself. So I went and I got a small pair of scissors, and that didn't work. Those were paper scissors. So finally, I had to go and get some box cutters from the toolbox. And I used those to cut open the plastic and take out the mouse. Now, once I have the mouse in my hand, I did not say, hey, I liberated the plastic. Like, that's not what happened. You know, now I have the mouse. That's what I was looking for. The plastic was put aside. I didn't need that. I did all that hard work for the mouse. I didn't do all that hard work to get the plastic. Similarly, in yoga, we do all the hard work of the yamas and niyamas and the asana and the concentration and the contemplation. We do all of that in order to allow ourselves to be immersed in our true nature. It's not to like drag the mind along with us.
One understanding that I've sort of been trying to get my head around is like the mind can only understand so much, right? Like when you think Purusha and this greater consciousness, like the mind has limited ability to understand that. So like we spend our whole life trying to understand our purpose and connect, but we can only understand with the limited resource that we have. Like it's just like it's incomprehensible what is actually true.
And I think that's what the whole point of Patanjali's yoga is, what the point of all of those steps are, is that the mind is a limited thing and it can't take us to that final place, to that final resting place of Purusha, of pure consciousness. It can't. We need to use it. We need to use the mind just like we need to use all the gunas to take us to the point at which we can push forward beyond the mind. And again, this is specifically for the Patanjali yoga philosophy style. This doesn't mean that in modern times, just like in modern times, we've added a lot more asanas. You know, we've added a lot more complex things into yoga in terms of physical movement. It doesn't mean we can't change things for ourselves, because the mind is super important. It's necessary. It's necessary for us to discriminate. It's necessary for us to understand. And while we're in the body, we have to understand its power and its usefulness. So this is not to put the mind down. It's just historically what Patanjali was talking about. We can't liberate the mind in the final stages of yoga.
It sounds like the idea of liberating the mind means like your mind will never worry again, or your mind will never think a wrong thought or an unhelpful thought again, or maybe respond in an overacting way or something. That would be the liberation of the mind. And we've talked about this before about, you know, when someone meditates and embarks on a meditation practice, that their mind still does all those things. I mean, those are reactions of, your natural reactions in your body's nervous system, the fight flight response, all of those are programmed into us. The mind is going to do all those things. When we meditate, we can we can choose, we put a little space there to choose whether we want to accept what the mind is offering us or whether we want to choose something differently. So I think the idea of liberating the mind might be confusing people, for people that it means like you would never ever worry again. And that's not going to happen either.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point because it becomes very harmful that way. I think if we understand what the place of the mind is, we can truly understand its usefulness and its importance rather than putting it off to the, as in, oh yeah, I can absolutely let go of all worldly things in my head. Well, no, you're in the world. If you're in the world, all those worldly things are always with you, including your mind. So let's see how we can use these discipline tactics, these discipline techniques to use the mind best. So I think that's a really important point. Yeah, we don't want to think that, yes, my mind is liberated, I'm Sattvic, I don't have to worry about a thing, and that's the objective, because that's not possible. If right now you're watching this video and you have a body and a mind, it's not possible for you. If you're watching this video without a body and a mind, okay, that's a different story. But right now, whoever's watching, it's not possible.
So it's like that understanding of how to use the mind, right? Like, so you don't have reactions, or you do have reactions because you have experiences. If you're a human being, you have experiences, therefore you can have reactions. But having control over the mind helps you with those reactions.
There you have it. Those are the 7+1 bonus myths of yoga that sometimes people believe. And oftentimes many people believe this because they haven't been exposed to the depth of yoga philosophy, both historically and also in the Yoga Sutras themselves as taught by Patanjali.
I think it's important to understand these myths, highlight that they exist, and get to the core of what is and is not true if you're a yogi, but also if you're a human having experience. There's so much in yoga that can offer us coping mechanisms and strategies to help us lead a more peaceful life. So whether you're a yogi or not, I think these concepts and philosophies are important to contemplate and study further.
I agree, Claire. No matter how long you've been doing yoga, you can sometimes slip back into believing these myths because we're living in the world. So it's great to re-examine them as part of our practice. So if you are interested in diving deeper into yoga philosophy, we have a 200-hour yoga teacher training coming up. It's live online with Parampreet, with Claire, with myself, and with you. You'll be in here and we'll be talking about all these philosophies and really getting into the core of understanding them more deeply. So we invite you to check that out on the website in the links below.